today we are, Rob Eisenberg is here, and he's the original architect of Caliban Micro, and Durandal, and he's going to tell us about Durandal.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to Matrix, who really made the trip possible, and a very pleasant experience so far. So really glad to be here. This is my first time in Dallas, second time in Texas, first time in Dallas. So it's thank you. So really a pleasure to be here, and I hope to just show some new things to you guys. Maybe give you some new ideas, some stuff to go play with, maybe some solutions to take back to your business, and just hopefully catch also a glimpse of, you know, the amazing stuff that's happening on the web and the directions that things are moving in. So I am Rob Eisenberg, and as already been mentioned, and I am the creator of Durandal, which is what we're going to be spending this evening talking about. I'm going to try to, we're going to go a little bit over an hour. I won't be offended if you, if you need to check out at some point. I think we're probably going to shoot between 60 and 90 minutes, and then hopefully maybe, I think we have time afterwards if anyone wants to ask questions. Before we get started, who is familiar with Durandal prior to? Yep, and who has used it or? Okay, great, excellent, awesome. So for those of you that have already used it, I would really love to meet you personally after the talk, if you can stick around and just hear from you personally about your experiences with it, good and bad. You know, that means a lot to me. It helps us really make things better and try and just continually improve the experience for you guys. So, with that said, some of you might be a little bit lost and don't even know what this is. So we're going to start by just talking about what is Durandal, and you know, where and how do I get it. And then we're going to look at 3 core pillars that it's built upon, talk about some key concepts, and look at some demos, and then we'll wrap up with some resources. I'm going to try and move through those first 3 things as fast as possible because I really want to get into some code. Just start giving me the stink eye whenever I keep talking too long and I don't get into the code, because I know a lot of you guys. How many of you guys are developers? Like really? Yeah. So I mean, developers like to see code, so I do. So hopefully I won't linger too long. So getting down to business. What is Durandal? Well, it is a JavaScript framework that is designed for these things called SPAs, which is the worst acronym ever, invented. But for some reason it stuck, and no one's thought of a better one yet. But it stands for single-page applications, which in itself is also not necessarily very descriptive either. So, but it's best understood, I think, if you think of examples that you've probably all seen or experienced. So Gmail, for example, would be considered a single-page app. This is I'm going to just come out. This would be an application where the primary user experience is all within a single HTML page without refreshes or navigating to other physical HTML pages. So you have a very rich interactive experience inside of one HTML page. Facebook, is not really a single page app, but it's sort of a hybrid. If you're kind of in that area of the app where you're looking at all your friends' stuff and typing stuff and clicking on pictures, you'll notice that a lot of times it doesn't actually navigate to a different page. You'll have a lot of rich interaction on one screen. So that's sort of an hybrid app. If you've used some of the modern tools for help desks, things like user voice, things like Zendesk, these are single-page apps. But basically, with a single-page app, you're usually going for more of a native type feel of an application, something that feels a little bit more like a desktop app, or a native phone app, or a native tablet app. Something that doesn't feel like your traditional website, but feels more like a rich interactive application experience. So these have come to be called SPAs, or single-page applications. And that's That's where we're at with that. If you do come up with a better name, please do let me know, because there's a whole line of people waiting to adopt any other term. All right, so Durandal is primarily for building these types of apps, and I do want to also note that it actually is used to build native apps on phone and on desktop using things like, is anyone familiar with PhoneGap? Mm-hmm. So PhoneGap's a really slick open source project that you can basically use to host your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS content as a native app on 7 or 8 different mobile platforms. So Durandal is designed to work inside of those confines as well. And then there's also things like Node WebKit, and what was the other one? Was it Bracket? Brackets that are designed for building desktop applications with HTML and JavaScript. And these give you full access to the hardware and all that kind of stuff and work across platforms. So even now, if you're thinking about building a desktop app, you're thinking, well, I can't write it because I need full access to the hard drive, and I need like TCP networking support and all this kind of stuff. Well, actually, you can do that now through some of these new sort of desktop Chrome or shims that you can run JavaScript apps in. So, and we've basically got Durandal running apps deployed on pretty much all those platforms. So in app marketplaces and on desktop, and of course in the browser. So apps everywhere, basically. Which I hope, I hope excites you. It really does me. For me as a developer, it's like very empowering. I worked a lot in the Microsoft stack for a number of years, and it was really a love-hate kind of thing for me. So as the world of HTML was really in the last 2 or 3 years, growing by leaps and bounds, it was very exciting to me to know of all these possibilities that were now opening up. A lot of things that weren't previously possible, or at least were extremely difficult. So if you want to build one of these kinds of apps, there's a bunch of different places to get it. Who's coming from a .NET background? Who's coming from like Ruby, Node.js, PHP, Java? All right, cool. So depending on which of those backgrounds, you've got a few different options. If you're coming from the .NET world and you want to get started really quickly building a Durandal app, you can get a Visuix from Visual Studio Gallery and install it in Visual Studio and just do File, New Project, Durandal app, and you've got a running app right there. And then you can just start adding your own content. There's also NuGet packages as well. If you're coming from Node.js, or if you're comfortable with some of the JS or Node.js based build tools like Grunt, things like this, we have Bower support, which is a front-end package manager, so you can pull down the libraries from there. You can use Mimosa, which is a Node.js based build tool, and it has a skeleton framework, so it'll generate a starter project for you for Durandal as well. And then of course, you can go right to the website and literally just download the framework or download a starter kit. That's just a plain HTML JavaScript starter kit. So Durandal does not care about what you're doing on the server at all. We try to provide some different starter kits so that depending on where you're coming from, you get something that feels a little bit more comfortable for you. So we're still expanding those. And so if you're coming from a platform like PHP or Ruby or Java and would like to contribute more of a native feeling starter kit based on that backend, please do get in touch. But worst case scenario, you can just download a zip file, and inside of it you've got a running app. Just unzip it, run it, and start editing the code. So Durandal.js is the website, and you can find all this information there as well, with the downloads page and all that stuff. So, moving on, I want to talk about the 3 pillars, because there's a number of these different single-page app frameworks that are out there. In fact, I noticed rather humorously that there was a book giveaway for AngularJS tonight, which is a competing framework with Durandal.js, right? But so there's a number of frameworks. A couple other big ones are AngularJS and Ember.js. Durandal's kind of new on the scene, if you will. but not so new in some ways, because we take a little bit of different approach. With Ember and Angular and some of the others, they're really sort of a whole hog or approach, or you have to kind of take the whole thing. But with Durandal, what we decided to do instead was, rather than reinvent the wheel, rather than build the entire thing from scratch, we want to look out in the larger JavaScript community and find out what libraries are out there that provided core functionality that we wanted for building a single page app, that already did it very well, that already had huge communities, that had real world usage on a variety of sites. And so what we decided to do is, instead of building everything from scratch, start with 3 core libraries that each specifically addressed the need of single page apps and did it very well and met those other requirements. So the first one is JQuery. So who's used JQuery or something like it, right? And then the next one is RequireJs. Anyone using RequireJs? And what about Knockout? Yeah. So I'll talk real quickly about each one of these. I think we can go past this real quick. I don't know if you can read that. It's from the JQuery homepage, but you know what JQuery does? It provides basically a DOM, a browser abstraction for things like DOM manipulation, selectors, eventing, things like this. So we said, this is proven. We need some of that. People want this when they build apps. Let's just use that. Let's not, reinvent that. So that's pretty simple. The next one is RequireJs. And what RequireJs is, solves a very serious problem in JavaScript, which is that the language does not support modules natively in its current version. And as you build these single-page apps, they tend to be a lot more complicated. A lot more code goes in them. And you really have to solve the issue of how are you going to handle encapsulation, how are you going to handle modularization, how are you going to handle script loading, when you've got lots of individual script files, how are you going to handle dependency tracking? This script depends on that one, and this has to load first, and so on and so forth. And so over the years, the community has basically came up with a standard called AMD, which stands for asynchronous module definition. And it's a standard way of kind of defining modules and declaring dependencies between modules. And there's several libraries out there that actually support this pattern, the biggest of which is RequireJs. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but when you write JavaScript with Durandal, it's all written as RequireJs modules. If you come from some other language, again, like .NET languages, PHP, Ruby, they all have some sort of module system, whether it's assemblies and namespaces and classes, or jars, or like CommonJS is what Node uses. There's some sort of way of doing this. So this is basically the same thing. You just gotta have to squint a little bit and tilt your head, and you'll see it, right? So if you ignore this, what we call the AMD wrapper, and you just look at the code in here in the middle, you'll see that we basically have these require calls. And this is a function, and then in there is a dependency, and that's really like a relative or absolute path to another script file. So require actually will return that module into that variable. So you can say, like, I want to have a customer module and define it here, and I want to have an order module and define it over here. And you can say order is dependent on customer, maybe, and you can bring it in by require customer. So, and what this does is it actually handles all the asynchronous loading, all the script ordering, and you get a pretty nice, simple syntax. Again, if you people get kind of tripped up by the AMD wrapper, that's what actually enables the asynchronous evaluation. But if you look at the inside, you'll see that it looks very much like, you can imagine this would be like an import statement or a using statement from some other language. If you've used IOC, anyone used IOC or dependency injections, things like that? So this is kind of a little bit like that too. It's kind of a little bit of a module system, but a little bit of an IOC kind of mixed together. That's just due to the dynamic nature of JavaScript. So you're going to write all your JavaScript like this. That makes everything encapsulated. That gives you declarative dependency tracking. That gives you asynchronous loading. And RequireJs is a library that just supports all that. And Durandal knows this and understands this and assumes you're going to write your app this way. So this library gives us modularization, which is really important. And then finally, Knockout, which gives us declarative data binding. So you can have a JavaScript object or model, and then your HTML, you can use these HTML5 data-bind attributes to declare a connection or a binding between the properties or attributes of your JavaScript object and HTML elements. So as first name changes, the input value will change, or as the input value changes, it will push that data back into your JavaScript object. So you get a two-way automatic synchronization of your JavaScript object state and the DOM. And this is really, really powerful. And Knockout does this by providing you with these special observables that you can grade and these data binding expressions. So those are the three libraries. Just to recap, I want to point out something really important about it. All these libraries are actually built for traditional website creation, not necessarily for single-page apps. So, and then I think this is really actually a really nice advantage of Durandal, which is that if you have used some of these libraries before, then you already know half of Durandal. So you got a jump start on that. If you haven't and you learn Durandal, then you're going to learn these libraries, and then you can take all that knowledge, and all these things can be used in your standard traditional web development. You know, if you got a lot of JavaScript in a regular website, you might want to consider RequireJs. If you have pages that have a lot of rich interactivity, but it's not really a single-page app, you might get some benefit out of Knockout. And I think probably most of you know about the benefits of JQuery in web development. So those are kind of our three pillars. And then what we do is we build on top of them a bunch of other pieces. We put them together in an opinionated way, and we build some other framework stuff on top that you need for single-page apps. So, jumping into that, we've already talked about some of this. When you want to build a single-page app, you need a framework that's going to give you modularization, because you're going to end up with a lot of code. So RequireJs is doing that. You need data binding, Knockout's doing that. And then we provide, one of the things Durandal provides is something called composition. So once you break your app down into all these small modules, how are you going to put them back together again, right, to actually display a screen? So Durandal gives you some declarative ways of reassembling screens and getting a lot of reuse. So we're going to look at that soon. All right, so let's jump into some code. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to get started. Because most of you guys are .NET, and that's kind of my background, I'm going to show the .NET way of setting up a new project. But just imagine that I'm working in your favorite IDE, and because it's all just HTML and JavaScript, it's really going to be the same for you once you open the files up in your own IDE. Okay? But for our purposes, I'm going to just create a new project. And for those of you, again, that are on the .NET side, just for your information, if you install the physics, you can just say new MVC site. You can say new Durandal spa project. You'll see it right there. Well, that really defeats the point, doesn't it? All right, well, after that stops, I'll show it to you again. I'm sorry about that, guys. In the house. So you would say new project, right, from Visual Studio, and then you'd say MVC app, and then you would see Durandal right there. And you just hit OK, and it will generate an entire project for you. I got all kinds of crazy stuff happening now. I don't actually use Team Explorer of my own will. I just want to let you know that.
You have to reopen the project.
New project. Now you actually do get to see it. So if you're using Mimosa, you can say Mimosa Skell new Durandal. It'll download it, the latest version of the skeleton, and it'll start it up for you, and you can run it. That's if you're a Node guy. If you're coming from any of the other platforms, or you're not comfortable with using Node build tools, you can just download. Again, you just download the HTML starter kit zip, unzip it, and just open the index HTML. and the app will run. This is just a single HTML page app. And then you can just open up the source in your favorite code editor. I like to use Sublime a lot. Anyone use Sublime? When using like WebStorm. So I use both of those a lot too, besides Durandal, depends on what I'm doing. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? I haven't shown you anything yet. I just blabbed a lot. So maybe you'll have some more questions afterwards. But just to make sure. Okay. So for those of you that are not .NET-ish, just ignore most of this. The really important thing is what's inside of app. And this is actually your single page app right here. You can name this folder app anything that you want, but like I mentioned, that's typically what that's what you'll see it called, at least in all the samples and demos and things like that. Let me just run this app so that you can see what it does, and then we'll see how it does what it does. So it's a really simple application. It has a little sort of spinner loading thing at the beginning, and then it animates into this page that just has some marketing materials. And then there's a main menu up here, and you can navigate to another screen, and you can click on pictures, and you can navigate back, and it stops you from navigating. Are you sure you want to do that? You say, no, I don't want to do that. I want to search. And, pops up messages, and you navigate and say yes, and it will navigate and animate back. And hopefully you're noticing, I don't know if you can see the hashes changing. So if I go to flicker, you'll see that there's a pound flicker there, and so on and so forth. So this is just a little starter template, right? That shows you how to do things like, we'll look at it, how to set up navigation, how to create your pages, how to show message boxes and modules, how to do some basic data binding, and so on and so forth. So let's actually look at how this is put together. And we'll start in an obvious place, which would basically be the HTML file. In this case, it's a CS HTML because this is an MVC thing, but just imagine it's .html if you're not .NET, because it's almost exactly the same. But the interesting part you want to note is there's almost nothing in the HTML page. There's basically a single div, and then there's a script tag. And the script tag points to RequireJs, and it has a data main attribute, which basically points to a specific module in your app. You can think of, it's called main because that's been the convention in so many languages. You usually have a main function or something like that that's the entry point of your application, or you have some bootstrapper code or some startup code. So I already showed you RequireJs, so you're going to write a module called main.js, and you're going to tell RequireJs to load that, and that's how your app's going to load. I will show that to you, but don't look too closely because it's actually not that important. The main.js is just used to configure the framework, and for 90% of your apps, you're just going to copy this file and forget about it because it's just some RequireJs setup and things like that you don't need to really worry about. But you'll do things like, I want to set my application's title up. I've got some plugins I want to load. I want to use the router. I want modal dialogues. I want widgets. I want to load those up. Then I want to start my app, so I'll call app start. And then I'm setting up some conventions. And the interesting part here is this thing called set root, which actually is what causes your app to display on the screen. So this is actually pointing to a module, which is called shell. And this app is actually split up into two different folders. Your view models, which are your modules that model out each screen in the app. And then your views, which are actually your HTML that corresponds with each of those modules. So in Durandal, we talked about how we're going to have modularization, and I showed you that RequireJS sample, and then I talked about how we're going to have binding, and then I said there's this thing called composition. I didn't really explain that to you. What happens is that Durandal understands some basic conventions, and it knows that if you have a shell.js, then there's going to be a corresponding shell HTML. So if you say display shell, it's going to go use RequireJS to grab the shell JavaScript file, grab the shell HTML file, data bind them together, and then automatically inject them into the DOM for you, and optionally animate them into the DOM. So that's the kind of work that Durandal does for you, compositing the entire screen. Now, inside of that shell, it might actually compose a navigation piece, content piece, a sidebar. It might do all kinds of other dynamic composition inside, and each one of those little pieces might be broken out into an individual module and an individual view. So this is what allows us to have that divide and conquer strategy in terms of building apps, and it gives a clean separation between our JavaScript code and our HTML code. So what you're looking at here on the screen is the shell. Can you guys see that code? Is it large enough?
Yeah.
Okay. So what we're looking at is the shell, which usually every app has something we call a shell. You can think of that as the Chrome of your app. That header, the footer, perhaps it might contain a sidebar. It really depends on the design of your app. But you can see here we're setting up a router. And I've actually used a different syntax than what I showed you for RequireJs, but let me actually rewrite it for you so you can see what it would, the syntax that I actually like better. But this is just a module. It's just really plain JavaScript. And we're just bringing in the router, which is a Durandal module. And then we're bringing in the app also, which is a Durandal module. So that's the syntax I showed you before. Don't get too bogged down in it right now, but I really want you to see that this is just basically this is just a JavaScript object that we're returning here. And we're just configuring a router with some route patterns, and those route patterns point to some modules. And what happens is Durandal sees that pattern here in the URL, and when it does it, when it matches it, it goes and it grabs that module for you, right? And you can see right over here, there's so when we match on Flickr, we've got viewModels Flickr there, and it goes and gets viewModels RequireJs. So anytime that pattern matches, it's going to go grab that module. Then conventionally, it's going to come down here and it's going to grab this Flickr HTML file. Then it's going to data bind them together so that you get that declarative binding between your JavaScript code and your HTML. Then it's going to inject it into the DOM and animate the screen in. So just so you know how it works kind of end to end, when I'm clicking on this, that's changing, it's matching the pattern, grabbing the module, grabbing the view, binding them together, injecting the DOM, animating the transition. So that's the kind of things Durandal does for you that you need when you build these larger scale apps. So how do you add a page, right? Let's actually write some code. So it's actually really simple. If we want to, say, add our custom page to this, all we have to do is create a module for that page. So I'm gonna just come in here and I'm gonna add a new, I'm gonna just call it my page, right? And we're gonna start following that simple define pattern that I showed you. So all JavaScript code is written as these modules. So we're just gonna define our module. And that's that AMD wrapper I talked to you about. You can kind of ignore it. We're just going to return an object, and that is our module. And just to make it interesting, let's just give it a property called a title with a value of my page. So this is just about the most basic module you can write. There's really no interesting functionality here. We'll add some in a minute. But we want to render this on the screen. Right, this is just some data. Maybe we have some functionality, but we want to actually see this, right? We want to navigate to this screen, right? So this is the behavior and the data of our screen. So let's add the view. So let's come down here to views. We'll add an HTML page, and we'll give it the same name, my page. And we're just going to delete all that because it's not really a page. It's just going to be a fragment here. Let's just give ourselves a div, and then let's give ourselves h2. And now we're going to use a data bind attribute. And so as I explained to you, those conventions are going to kick in when our route, we'll set up a route in a minute, but when it navigates to this module, it's going to find this view and it's going to bind them together, which means that the value of this h2 is going to be kept synchronized with the value of this property, because we've basically told it the text of the h2 is bound to the title property of the module. And then basically we can come into shell, and we need to just add another route here. Again, it's really simple. I'm just going to duplicate that, and we're going to map it to my page. And let's give it a route of something. So just so you see that there's a difference between the the ID and the route. And if we refresh, so I made an error, which I might have had a typo. Let's see.
Your router is in plugins.
What's that?
You configured the router, it's in plugins, it's not under Durandal actually. All the way, first line.
Oh. Thank you. Good catch. Good catch. So now you see something is up there, and I click on it, and there's my HTML that I created. So it's doing all this plumbing for you, basically. If you want to build a navigation app like this with pages that you navigate back and forth to, all you have to do is create a JavaScript module, drop it in your project, and create the corresponding HTML, drop it in your project, and then declare your bindings to show how they're connected. And it's really that simple, and it just scales out like that. Now, inside of those pages, you might do more complicated things, right? But the same techniques will apply. So hopefully that gives you a sense of, you could grab the starter kit and start playing around with it and dropping code in there. But really, that is the technique for building pretty much everything. You create a module, you create a view, you declare the bindings between them. And Knockout lets you basically bind just about anything. So if you want to bind CSS properties, or class names, for example, or turn classes on and off based off of data, or input values, or if you want to for each over an array of data, all those kind of things can be done through declarative bindings. So you will keep a clean, simple JavaScript module that has only your data and your behavior. And then you keep a clean, simple HTML view that is declaratively bound to that. You just drop them in your project, and then you can start to compose together the app. You'll start with simple page-to-page things, and then you'll do some more complex things, I'll show you in a minute, that leverage the same techniques. But one of the things about Durandal is that it tries to be very self-consistent in how you construct things. So if you understand these couple of basic concepts here, that's actually how everything works. If you want modal dialogues, you make a module, you make a view, and you tell it to display it as a modal. That's it. You've got a really complicated page with a sidebar and a header and a footer and some list of things, and then when you click on one of those, it expands into a detail. And, well, you can break those all out into individual modules, each with their own encapsulated HTML, and compose those pieces back together and leverage that that convention of the module and the view pairing and the binding, and it will just do the heavy lifting for you. You want to build widgets? We support skinnable, templatable widgets, meaning you can create a widget with behavior and a default view, and then per use, you can override fragments of the widget's view. All right? So how do you build that? Well, you create a module, and you create a view, and you drop them in your project. So the same technique, basically, is used consistently throughout, depending on what you're doing, but it's all the same concept, basically. So those are the key concepts: modularization, binding, and composition. Once you kind of get your head around those, everything is built on top of that. Any questions so far? I'm actually going real fast. So
probably a dumb question, but can you do like the equivalent of a 404 page? So if you type in misspelling or whatever, like somebody cuts and pastes the link.
So by default, Durandal will kind of not do anything. It'll go back to, I don't know if you saw what I did, but it went back to the last route. But you can actually come in here and there's an API on the router that you can call to handle unknown routes. And you could say, anytime there's an unknown route, use this module. Or you can say, anytime there's an unknown route, here's a function, I'm going to tell you dynamically what to do. And so you can actually write your own routing conventions that way. You could ditch the route table entirely and just write a custom function for map unknown routes and establish your own application conventions and dynamically return the route data back to the router based off of, it'll parse all the URL stuff out for you, hand all the information to you and say, just please tell me what module you want to display. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And in terms of route patterns, I'll show you some more route pattern stuff you can do. They can be parameterized, they can have splats, they can have optional parameters, things like that. So, any other questions? Yeah.
I noticed you guys just came out with 2.0 and you changed a few things significantly. And I was just curious, do you expect more significant changes in the near future, or kind of where are you headed with that?
Yeah, so I plan to stay on 2.0 very long. So with 2.0, we are very strictly sticking to semantic versioning, and so you will know by the version numbers exactly what has changed. We're about to release 2.0.1 in the next week or two, and that's purely bug fixes. No new features, no breaking APIs, nothing. And we're going to work on 2.1 after that. That's new APIs and bug fixes, but no breaking changes. And we plan to stay on 2.x for quite a while. The 2.0 was a big change because we rewrote the router entirely from scratch. There were a number of issues there. We cleaned up a lot of APIs based on feedback from the community to make things a lot more consistently named and consistent behaviorally. And I don't foresee need to break things for quite some time. So we'll probably just see bug fixes and then new APIs.
Okay.
And a lot of those will be delivered through plugins. I haven't talked about plugins yet, but I will in a minute.
So, and do you still use BreezeJS?
I personally don't use BreezeJS, but so for those of you that are unfamiliar, there's a JavaScript library called BreezeJS, which is concerned with data. Talking to the server, getting data back, and surfacing it as objects that have internal change tracking on them and automatically can save back to the server and stuff like that. And so there's a number of templates and training materials out there that use Durandal in combination with BreezeJS. Because Durandal currently does not really give you anything for dealing with data. It kind of says, well, we're not going to go there because there's already stuff out there. And everybody seems to have their own opinion on that anyways. But a lot of people have used it together, so I mean, if you like it, use it. Most of the projects I personally work on, that's not a right fit for them.
What do you usually use?
Just JQuery, Ajax, just straight up, REST calling.
Okay, cool.
Calling the REST services, yeah. But a lot of people writing line of business apps like to use something like Breeze because it does you can get back this rich relational object model and it does all the change tracking and you can just push the changes to the server. So it really depends on what type of app you're building. Okay. I'm not working on a lot of those kind of apps right now. Any more questions?
So do you have any plans of creating different navigation models like horizontal navigation model, vertical navigation model? Because there's a lot of repetition of code here, so is there any way we can not add routes again and again? Is there a default way of doing things?
That's the second part of that question? There's not like two questions there. So
yeah, without adding a route, I mean, is there any other way to automatically plug in by writing a convention?
Like a scan, like if you were to use an IOC?
Yeah, there's no concept of that because of the nature of JavaScript.
But wasn't there in the original Durandal like mapped routes automatically?
Yeah, so that would be handled by the by the handling of unknown routes. In which case you would provide a function and then you would dynamically tell it what the route information was. So that's not really scanning, it's just looking at what happened in the URL and then you write your own code and basically tell the framework what to do.
But that would let you set up a convention and not have to add a route.
Exactly. And there are people that are doing that, but there's not a way to necessarily scan and detect architect, like with an IOC, you can say, give me everything that implements this interface, and then on the right. But TypeScript is only at compile time. All the type information is erased. So now, in terms of horizontal versus vertical navigation, that's really just a matter of the HTML and CSS, and my default template just has it vertical across the top, but you could rewrite that and for each create a UL, LI structure, down the side of a page. And I'll actually show you something like that in another sample that has a 2-level navigation with 2 separate routers, a parent and a child router. That's a little bit more advanced to get to that. Any other questions? I know I'm going real fast with some of this, but hopefully I really want you to just, in your head, just remember module, view, data bind, compose, right? So these high-level concepts will help you to basically understand any Durandal app, how it's put together and how it comes together. All right. So there are a few other interesting concepts involved. I showed you the ones that are really the most important. So these are kind of like a tier 2 set of concepts. Something called the lifecycle. When we compose things, that's not like a black box, right? So we have this lifecycle of how those pieces are put together, how your module is attached to your view. And there's a whole bunch of callbacks in there that you can get access to all kinds of information and at different points in time in that process to do different things. Sometimes when you're building real apps, actually almost every time when you're building real apps, you come across a situation where data binding is not quite powerful enough on its own to handle the type of UI that you need to build. Or maybe you want to use a JQuery plugin that has this really slick drop down or tooltips or slider or something like that. Well, how are you gonna basically talk to the view to hook up that plugin? So there's a couple of different ways to do it. Knockout, its binding system is extensible, so sometimes that's the right approach. But if that approach doesn't work, you have these lifecycle callbacks that you can add, any of them optionally to your view model to basically have Durandal tell you, okay, I just data bound things, and here's the view. Go ahead and go to town on it, with JQuery or whatever. There's a lot of these callbacks. And I'm not going to go into detail, but just know that they're there. So the most important one people seem to use is this attached callback, which a lot of people use to load data from the server. And the cool thing about it is you can return a promise from that, and the binding system understands that and will halt the data binding until after your data is returned asynchronously. Which brings me back to the other concepts, promises. So who is familiar with promises? So for those of you who are not, there's a lot of asynchronous code that you end up having to write. And it's nice to have a consistent way of handling that. And that's what promises provides. Excuse me. In other languages, you'll see these referred to maybe as tasks if you come from a C#-ish background. Some other languages, platforms, will call these futures. But it's an object that basically represents some piece of data that's going to be given to you at some point in the future, or some action that's going to complete at some point in the future. So Durandal, everything in Durandal that could be asynchronous returns a promise. So Durandal is all very self-consistent in terms of how it handles asynchronous code. JQuery, you may or may not know, returns promises from all of its asynchronous APIs. So its animation APIs return promises, its Ajax APIs return promises. And Durandal not only exposes promises from its asynchronous APIs, but internally understands them. So if you were to load some data in that attached callback, if you return the promise back to Durandal, it detects that and says, okay, he wants me to halt the process of composing this fragment of the screen until all that data has come back. So it understands internally promises, and you'll see some more of that in a minute. But if you're not familiar with that, definitely something to check out, because it will change the way that you handle asynchronous code in the client. It really makes things a lot cleaner. And then, so we've got the binding lifecycle or the composition lifecycle. We've got promises, and then plugins. Plugins is, something you probably all know. JQuery has plugins. Durandal has plugins too. It just extends the API, adds additional features. The router is a plugin. You might write an app that is not a navigation app, so we don't make you take a dependency on the router plugin if you don't want it. But if you want a router, you bring it in. Maybe you don't need modal dialogues, or you don't want our implementation of modal dialogues. Well, then you just don't install the dialogue plugin. So things like that are not absolutely essential to the core Durandal are in plugins. You can bring them in optionally, and that's really all there is to that. And everything else in Durandal is just sugar on top of that. Like I mentioned, widgets. So widgets is a plugin, but it's just syntactic sugar on top of the composition engine. As I mentioned before, you want to create a widget, you just create a module and an HTML file. And you data bind them together, and you're pretty much done. There's a little bit of sugar on top of that to make the syntax for using widgets a little bit nicer. But under the covers, it actually just calls into the composition engine, does the same stuff you could do manually. Just makes it nicer for you. So if you focus on those core concepts, you'll see that everything else is built on top of it, basically. And the thing about Durandal is Durandal itself is built the same way that it expects you to build your own apps. Durandal is a set of AMD modules. That's all it is. So it's kind of self-consistent with the way that it asks you to build things as well. Okay, don't stare at that too long. There's docs on the site if you're interested in all the kinds of different callbacks you can get, and what they do and what they mean and when they happen. Speaking of which, before we go to the demo, the second demo. So durandaljs.com is the website. A lot of what I showed you in the first demo, if you go to get started, you'll see a lot of the similar process. So if you want to work yourself back through getting set up and adding a new page and all that kind of stuff, you'll see a lot of that here. And it explains, like, coming from .NET, coming from Node.js, if you use Bower, if you want to do manual setup. So it gives you kind of instructions how to get set up. Explains the project structure, explains the code, and kind of walks you through the various pieces and how to add new things. Downloads, like I said, you can get the raw code for the library, or you can get these starter kits or samples. Everything's there. But the place you'll probably spend most of your time is in the docs. So there's quite a bit of documentation here, and I've tried to organize it based on tasks, things that you might want to do. So you just want to learn about how to create a module. There you go. If you need, I talked about those callbacks, so you can come in here and kind of see a lot of information about the callbacks. If you're wanting to know, okay, well, how do I create a widget? Well, creating a widget. So they're kind of oriented around those kind of things. So you can dig in deeper to the different plugins and to the different tasks that you might have to do as part of building an app. So that's all there. And I'll mention some other stuff on that. So any more questions before I go on to the second demo?
What does Durandal mean?
Durandal is the name of a sword that Roland used. That was given to him by Charlemagne. And and where does that come from? Well, the other open source project that I'm known for is called Caliburn Micro, which comes from a project that I did called Caliburn. Caliburn is another sword, and it's the old name for Excalibur. And that name came from, so that lived in the XAML world, and this is a long story, right? But it's a long explanation. WPF, which was the first XAML technology, its code name was Avalon. And Avalon was the island where Excalibur was forged, right? So that's where Caliburn came from, and I just decided I would stick with a theme of mythological swords, for my open source project. So Durandal. Hack and slash your way to application victory. a whirlwind. Who has actually built a single page app with any kind of framework before? For those of you that haven't, I know that a lot of this is probably pretty foreign. It looks very different than your traditional web development. And the thing I would just keep in mind is that what we're going for here is like more of what looks like a desktop app or a native app with a very rich experience. And we're talking about things that typically have a lot of code. Not just like a few hundred lines of JavaScript or even a few thousand lines of JavaScript. Some of these have tens of thousands of lines of JavaScript. I think Microsoft's implementation of their new, it's the Team Foundation online stuff is like 100,000 lines of JavaScript code in it. So we're talking about, as we move more and more into these rich client-end experiences, it ends up being more code, more stuff ends up being on the client, then we got to deal with these organizational issues, these encapsulation issues. And so that's some of what Durandal is trying to deal with, giving you a structure and an organization for your code and a way to keep things encapsulated and a methodology and a strategy to break down complex problems and to put things back together.
How well does it integrate with testing frameworks? Do you have any recommendations on that?
Yes, but wait another week and a half for our official docs on that. So it does work fine, and in fact we've got unit tests for Durandal. And so what I've told people is like, if you want to test your app, go actually pull out our test folder out of the repo and just delete our tests and start adding your own. But we've actually got several community contribution articles that are going into the docs in the next site release in the next week or two that will give a few different strategies, setups for creating a testing environment for Durandal apps. But it's completely testable, and RequireJs is actually way to your benefit in this because it makes it really easy to mock out in dependency because everything is required through those require statements. So if you want to mock something out, you just define that a fake or a stub or a mock of that thing, and then when require brings it in, it'll bring in the fake, right? So it makes it really easy to test. I mean, modularized code in general is easier to test, so this really helps.
And that works with pretty much any testing framework?
In theory, I've used Jasmine. Some people are using some other things. I can't remember, but it shouldn't. Like what you actually use to write the test doesn't really matter. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing, at least in my mind, there's nothing that would cause problems.
So do your tests have fakes and stubs and mocks? Examples of how to do that?
So there's some fakes in the Durandal test. Yeah, so you can see some examples.
In Knockout, I know it's like to clean up after yourself for memory management. They have like a clean node method. Does your app do any? Does Durandal do anything to sort of automate that?
Yeah,
it does.
Yeah, the composition engine. Whenever there's a lot of fine-grained control that you have actually, and so I didn't show you, but I actually show. Let me show you some. I'll wait till the next demo and I'll show it to you. But when you compose some part of a screen, you can turn some knobs on that and tell Durandal, like, actually I want you to cache all the different views I'm going to be switching out inside the DOM. Just only show me the current one, right? So when I'm switching from page to page, you can tell it, keep them all in the DOM. Okay. Right? That's fine for small apps and improves performance, but not great for memory. So you can say, don't cache them. In which case, it automatically talks to the knockout, and when it switches views out, it completely cleans up and disposes of itself. So yeah, it handles calling the apply bindings, connecting things up, and disposing of things. Now that doesn't mean you can get away with not thinking about memory management, because that definitely is an issue with single page apps. So you have to think about building, you have to be thinking about that in terms of how you're constructing your modules and objects and things like that. But in terms of how it interacts with Knockout, it handles that for you. So whenever it composes a new page in or a new module in and drops the other one out, it completely cleans all that up.
Okay, cool.
We did have one memory leak that was fixed in the patch release coming out in the next week and a half as well, which only happened in some edge cases. But yeah. Any other questions? Oh yeah.
Does it come with a minification agent? Or
so RequireJs, because all our code is built with RequireJs. RequireJs has an optimization tool called RJS. And what you can do is actually run that against your app and have it minified if you want. But the other thing that it does is it takes all your files and it combines them into one, including your views. So it'll inline your HTML in the file so that in the end, if you want, it's all optional. If you want, you can have a single file that contains all your JavaScript and all your HTML. Now you can use that tool to break your app down in any way. So for example, if you've got large apps, perhaps you want to break your app down based off of user role. And maybe you only want to download the features that pertain to the logged in user. So you might actually take and optimize your app into several modules. One is kind of like the initial payload, as the shell and the login screen and all this. And then once they're logged in, based on their user role, perhaps, this is just one example of something you might do. Then you might pull down another file that contains all the JavaScript and all the HTML and the features that that user role uses. Or perhaps you want to break down your app by features and dynamically load features based off of usage. So you can do that. You can optimize it in any way. A lot of people end up with a single file optimization because their apps aren't humongous. But we do have people building apps that have hundreds of screens. And so I tell them, that you don't want to optimize that into a single file because then they're going to be sitting there waiting while 5 megabytes downloads. So you're going to be a little smarter about that. But RJS lets you do that. You basically kind of create a little build file and tell it, what modules go into what final build, and then it can do the uglification or minification for you as well. Now we also have a tool called Wayland, which is sort of like Grunt. It's a build tool that's a little bit more tailored to Durandal apps, and it will automate the RequireJS optimization for you, so you don't have to configure RJS, which can be a little bit cryptic if you haven't done it. So the answer is yes.
Not to be confused with the display protocol.
Right. Exactly. But I had to stick with my sword themes. So Wayland was the smith that forged Durandal. So that's where I'm at. I mean, I write open source just so that I can reference these. Any more questions? Okay, what I want to do is actually look at another sample, and this one's a little bit more like a real app you might write. It's definitely more complicated. It's still sort of demo material. It doesn't have a real backend, for example. It sort of has an in-memory faked backend. But it's a lot more complicated structurally. There's a lot more features you'll see, and I want to show you how some of this composition stuff I'm talking about plays out to give you really nice modularized code, really simple code, and good reuse. So let me just show you the app, and then I think we have plenty of time, actually. Do we? Well, it is 7:51, right?
Yep.
All right. Okay, so this app is kind of a login screen. The premise of this app is that it is patterned after Zendesk. Has anyone used Zendesk? Has anyone used user voice? So these are like help desk, customer support products. So your typical features you might expect, like basic user management, the ability to submit tickets, have a conversation about a support ticket, close it, open it, so on and so forth, basic settings, log in, log out, that kind of stuff. I use Zendesk for a couple of my own products, including if you get paid support for Durandal, I use Zendesk to handle that. So I actually really, really like that app. It's a great single page app. It's not built with Durandal, but I know somebody on the team, so I'm going to be razzing them about that. But I patterned this demo after their UX. I mean, I blatantly stole it. I mean, I looked at their screen, and then I created my screen, and then I looked at their screen, and then I created my screen. Okay, so if you've used Zendesk, you can see that the colors and the names are changed, but the rest is very simple. Obviously, building something for real like Zendesk is very non-trivial. This is just a demo to show you something. So I'm just going to log in, and then we're going to basically come together on our home screen. You're going to see something that's a lot more complicated than your basic hello world navigation. So you're going to see that we have this activity, a feed here. We've got 2 charts displaying, and then we've got some news down the bottom. On the side, we've got some icons. This is our side navigation. And then up here, we've got you know, some other things. So we can navigate around and see our list of tickets that are open, bug tickets. I can click on one. I can dig into the ticket. You can see we open a tab up here, and I can, you know, comment on it and submit it as solved, so on and so forth. I can go into my users, kind of see my list of users. So here's kind of like your master detail view where we have your list on the side and your details over here, and I can, you know, they all obviously are me. Like I said, this is fake data. It's not because I think I'm the center of the world or anything like that. It's just I know me better than anything else, so I put my name in. So you can see the URLs changing up here. User 1. I click on this one. It's users 2, but only this portion of the screen is now navigating. So that's a parameterized route. We'll look at that. As I talk here, we've got our tickets, and then each one of these tickets has a unique URL, so you can see there's ticket 4. Now see I've opened up another tab, and I can actually switch between my 2 tickets that I'm working on. I can go over to my settings. And here I've got a child router, which I'll show you that, you know, this is a sample app, so I didn't go through and actually build out all the screens here. But you can see how I'm navigating. If you look up here, you can see now I'm at settings, feedback tab, and I'm navigating the side portion to these different screens. I can come here and I can add a new ticket. I can type. There might be a bug there. And it opens up a new tab for that new ticket, and so on and so forth. So hopefully this gives you at least a sense of like, okay, this is like a little bit more like a real application. There's actually something that looks like features here. There's a little bit more interesting UI with these tabs and the side navigation and the nested child routers, and you know, there's some other things going on here too that are a little bit more advanced. Like we've got integration with charting controls. We've got integration with the rich text editor over here, things like that. So what I want to do is take a few minutes to just look at a couple of different features in this app and zoom in to see how Durandal is used to accomplish some of these things. And I'll try and point out, you know, like I said, I'll try and point out the interesting tidbits about that. And again, we're going to be going pretty fast through that. So,
Even faster?
how about this? It's sitting right here. Because a laptop like this does not go very long without power.
So Durandal can detect better uses?
That's right. Actually, there's browser APIs coming around stuff like that. All right, now. Very responsive. This is a responsive, or is it an adaptive API? Which one is it? But, all right, so, yeah, let's do that. For starters, I know it's really small. Can you guys see the structure on the side at all? Maybe I can make the font a little bit larger. The environment font. Should I do that? Front row says it's fine, so you guys in the back can see that. But so this app is actually organized in a way that I like to organize apps by feature area. So if you look under app, you'll see that there's home, login, services, settings, shell, tickets, users, widgets, and then there's your main. So this is sort of organized according to the features of the application. So I know if I'm going to work on tickets, everything pertaining to tickets is going to be under tickets. That's the way that I like to organize things. Durandal gives you a lot of flexibility about how you organize. But the main thing it does want you to do is be consistent about your decisions. Because then it can kick in and give you the conventions, or let you write your own conventions so that you can tell it how to construct things. We'll start with main.js just because you're going to see that this looks almost exactly like the other sample I showed you. It is loading some plugins. I didn't point this out before, but you call app configure plugins to turn your plugins on. So you can see that this is loading the router plugin, loading the dialog plugin, it's loading the widget plugin, and specifically it's registering a custom widget called grid, which I built for this sample. And then there's another very interesting plugin called observable, which I want to point out. If you recall, and for those of you that use Knockout, when I showed you the Knockout code, you had to create these observable objects, these ko.observable for every property you wanted to two-way data bind. And that, it can be a real pain sometimes. So for Durandal, we've got this observable module which you can turn on. It's only supported in ES5 browsers, so that means IE9 and above, and anybody else. You know, if you can constrain yourself to IE9 or above, you can turn this observable module on, and then you can forget that Knockout's there at all. You don't have to create observables anywhere. You can data bind two-way to a plain JavaScript object. Arrays, properties, everything. So for those of you that haven't used Knockout as much, that maybe you're not, that doesn't, like you don't quite maybe you're catching the significance of that, but for those of you that have, if you can go to an ES5 browser, definitely check it out. Yeah.
Will it attach observables to nested object literally?
Yes, it doesn't matter what it is.
It just goes, does it?
Yeah. It works over arbitrary object graphs, but it's only supported with IE9 or above. But so this sample, you're not going to see Knockout anywhere in the JavaScript. You're just going to see plain JavaScript objects. So that's because of that. And there's a few other things too, which I'll point out as we get along. But other than that, you can see that the app just starts out by setting root, which is basically displaying your app. And instead of displaying a shell this time and a full navigation structure, it actually just goes ahead and displays only a login screen. So this actually causes the entire app to be guarded by a login screen. There's a bunch of different strategies for handling login, and this one's pretty simple, so that's what I wrote with this demo. So that's going to basically bring up, that's going to basically go to login. And again, just like I showed you, there's that pattern. There's your index.js under login, and your index.html under login. So you know that when you set root to login index, it's going to go get those two files, it's going to data bind them together, and it's going to inject them into the page. And it's just really simple stuff. This is just a, this is a kind of your typical JavaScript constructor class-ish, pattern. So it's just an object with a few properties for username, password, and message, and then a function, that represents the OK button. And you can see over here, we've got a form, and we're data binding the username, and we're data binding the password, and then we're data binding the button to that OK function. So this is pretty straightforward stuff at this point. And then, assuming a successful login, it then basically dumps the entire application and loads a whole new one, so to speak. Basically, it loads the real app, right? Because before we just kind of guarded everything with this login screen. So we're going to set our root module to our shell, and that's really the real app. And so our shell lives down here. You see right from the get-go that our shell, I've actually chosen to break this down a little bit more. So it's not just one module and one view, because the shell in this case is a little bit more complicated. And one of the simple things I did was I broke the header and the sidebar out into their own views. If we look at the code, we're not going to dig through this line by line, but you should just see some similar patterns here. And I want to call out the router because we talked about different things the router can do. So these are all the routes for the app at the root level. And we can see that for route, we can actually have an array of patterns that all map to the same module ID. We can have that static value of tickets. This is how we declare that there's a parameterized route. So this pattern will match tickets, whack, some identifier. And that identifier will be passed to your module automatically. Multiple patterns, the same, static patterns, parameterized patterns, patterns with optional parameters. So if it's just users, it will map to this module, or if it's users whack some identifier, it'll also map to this module. And then finally, the asterisk denotes a splat. So this will actually, the word details doesn't matter in this case. This will match anything that starts with settings at all, regardless of what's behind it. And actually the settings module, we'll take a look at it in a minute, it actually has a child router that maps nested routes beyond that settings fragment. So with that, you can actually fully encapsulate an entire feature area of your app, give it its own router, and it doesn't really matter where it lives in the route hierarchy. You can remap it at the top level. So in that way, you can sort of encapsulate entire portions of your app. But there's some other functionality here we're not going to dig into right now. But this is just the shell. It's setting up the router. Let's look at the HTML because this is where you'll start to see a little bit more concretely some of the compositional things that are going on. So we look at HTML, all of a sudden you're like, well, where is it? So this is the shell, and I'm using some knockout syntax called containerless binding, which allows you to use comments to data bind things without having to have an HTML element. And that's useful when you don't want to add an extra div into your hierarchy just so that you can put a data binding in to bring some other piece in, right? So you can just think of that these comments are actually going to be replaced at runtime by fragments or views. The key part to see is this word compose right here. That comes from Durandal. And what this is actually saying is right here in the DOM, go out and get shell whack header.html, take all that HTML and compose it right into the spot, and data bind it against the current binding context. Since this is the shell's view, it's actually going to get bound against the shell model as well. The same thing with the sidebar. Go out, get the sidebar HTML, and just inject it right here and data bind it against the shell. So you can see if I jump over here and look at header, it was kind of a big chunk of HTML, so I decided, it's kind of a reasonable thing to break out because it's the header, So let's just break all that out. So you can see here we're setting up our tabs that you saw across the top. We're setting up the drop down for the user when you click on the avatar, and some other things like that. The spinner that shows when it's loading data and so on and so forth. So I broke that all out into HTML, and it's composed back into the DOM declaratively with that compose binding. And same thing with the sidebar. Again, the sidebar, debatable whether it needed to be broken out. It's really not that much, but you can see that it's also broken out into its own stuff with its own binding statements, binding against that same shell. But the HTML is more componentized, so it's easier to kind of break things apart and understand what those pieces are. And then the interesting thing here is there's another binding called router, which gets added into the system when you add that router plugin in. And remember I said everything is built on top of composition. So anything that you don't recognize as that is probably just sugar on top of composition. So router is really just a shortcut for a compose binding that sets up a bunch of configuration options for you. And what this actually does is it detects that you have a router on your shell, and it just connects everything up. So that when the navigation happens and the state of that router changes, it says, actually we need to show this new page now. This binding causes the new page to be animated, to be composed into the screen, animated with the entrance transition. And in this case, its view is cached in the DOM. Because there's only like four pages in this app, so it caches them in the DOM for performance reasons. So that's actually really all there is to declaratively setting up the router. And you could write different HTML around this. You could put this router binding in a different place in your HTML, and the router will navigate and animate in the new screens wherever you have that router binding in the DOM. So this is hopefully starting to show you a little bit of how composition works. And when I start to dig into these individual pages, you're going to see that each one of those individual pages also uses composition internally to bring together its components. So it can be recursive to the degree that you want to break things apart. So this is composition of just a view, just an HTML fragment we're composing in here. This is essentially composition of dynamically changing data. Whatever the router says the current page is, when it changes, that part of the DOM updates dynamically. And it follows that process we've been talking about. Once we got that module, then we go find the view, then we data bind them together, then we push it in. In the case we play an animation when we push it in. And if you've got any of those callbacks that we talked about, all those get called as part of that process too.
How does it know? You have 2 routers. How does it know which one?
Great question. It just does. There's another router binding inside of the settings that is bound against the router at that scope. So it's really based off of how things are kind of scoped, if you will. I'll show you that in just a minute. We can actually, let's just go look at it right now since it pertains. If I open up this settings section, if I open up settings, you'll see that actually, well, there's a lot of stuff underneath settings because in theory, there's all these sub-features under settings. Now, they're just placeholders because this is a demo. But you can imagine how, like, you know, your API settings might actually be a significant piece of API with all your, of code and so on and so forth. But if we look at the index inside of here, you'll see that right here, that's that root router. It calls create child router on that. It creates a completely new router that's a child and connected back up to that parent. And then it makes it relative, which basically says whatever route you're coming in on, all the routes I'm about to define are relative to that, right? That's what this from parent true does. And if we look in the view for this, you see that it actually has its own router binding. That's going to be binding against, because these are automatically hooked together, everything's scoped, the module and its view are scoped to one another. This router binding binds to, this router, which is the child router. So what it means is as the navigation happens, when something that affects the child router's route changes, it actually only recomposes that part of the screen, not the whole thing. And you can have child routers, I suppose, too, but you might ask yourself whether that presents a usability issue. But that's how it works. And this is really powerful, I think. This is actually a really good use case for the child router. These are actually pretty static routes, but it keeps this whole settings feature completely encapsulated. So these routes, the shell doesn't need to know or care about the internal features of settings. It's all its routes. So in theory, this is actually really great if you have a large team working on a large app. Perhaps you have a part of the team who owns the settings feature. And that means they don't have to go out and touch the shell every time they need to add something to settings. One of the reasons that we do modularization and all this is also to support team structures and being able to parallelize work. So this feature actually, a child router helps along that line as well. So that's how child routers work. So that's just sugar on top of composition. You can actually write the compose binding all out that does this exact same thing. It's just a little bit verbose. So I created this shortcut binding to make it nice for you. Okay, let's look at the home screen, because that's also another really interesting one for a couple of reasons. The first is looking at the module. Actually, just ignore this line right here, because that's just an optimization, it doesn't matter. This gives me a good opportunity to show you another feature of the observable module. Remember I said that one's plugged in only for ES5 browsers? And I talked about how Durandal understands promises. Get recent activity and get news both return a promise for data. They do not actually return the activity list and the news list. But the observable module understands promises, and when it sees properties that are promises, it will wire for the completion of them and automatically transform your model from a promise into the data structure, which means that you can data bind against a promise, and inside the HTML, the template will actually work against the data when it comes in. So let me just show you the two pieces side by side. So get recent activity returns a promise for an array of activity. And then in the HTML, I just I just data bind to it as if it's an array using this for each binding. And under the covers, Durandal handles that automatically. It says, oh, you've got this promise. Let me wire for the completion of the promise. When it completes asynchronously, I'll take that array and I'll hook all this stuff up, and then data binding takes over and your list of activities displays. So and the news is working the same way. Wherever it is. What's down here? So there's your for each binding on news. And for those of you that are a little bit less familiar with Knockout, you can probably guess what for each does, but basically what is inside of here gets repeated for every element in the array. And of course it's dynamic, so if you add things to the array, it adds it into the DOM. If you remove things from the array, it removes it from the DOM. So that works great for this asynchronous scenario because there's nothing in the array, and then as it comes in, it can populate it. Yeah.
Will it wait for both promises to complete?
So that brings me back to the code, which is, we talked about those callbacks that you get as part of the composition process. In the case of the home screen, I made a decision as thinking about UX or whatever, that I actually wanted to not display the home screen until both of those promises return. So I can do that in Durandal by implementing activate, and when it's before it binds, it will call activate, and if you return a promise from that, Durandal will subscribe to that basically and wait for the promise to complete before it data binds and joins them all together. So I use the little JQuery when and pass both promises in, which actually creates a new promise that resolves when both promises resolve. You don't have to do that. I did it in this case. That's really a decision you will make based off of what kind of user experience you want. But that's basically what this does. So super simple code. Don't worry about that. And now I want to show you some other composition, right? Because we saw the activity list. Let me just bring it up to refresh your memory. So you have the activity list here, and then you have the news list down here. But then you got these two grids. So there's no code for those grids inside of the home screen. This is another example of composition. If you look right here, we've got a compose statement, but we're not composing just an HTML in. Whenever there's no file extension, it assumes that there's a module and a view. So here we're actually saying, oh, there's a grid1.js file and a grid1 HTML. And there's a grid2.js and a grid2 HTML. So effectively what happens here is you're declaratively telling Durandal, go out, get grid1.js, go out, get grid1 HTML. Hopefully you're seeing a theme here. Data bind them together and inject them right there in the DOM. So that way, like your little visualization, it's all encapsulated. And not only is it encapsulated so that the home screen doesn't need to know about its inner workings, but it's also, its concerns are separated, right? So that it has its JavaScript code and its view code. So here we've broken down this complex screen with this list, these two lists, and these two different visualizations into 3 different parts. Right? So you can see now this composition is sort of internally, almost like recursive composition. When you think of how the entire screen is formed. First the shell is composed, then the current page is composed, and then inside of this page, we've got these two visualizations that are each individually composed together.
Are those properties dynamically settable? Like, did I say home grid plus X?
Yeah. Yeah, you can actually, and in fact, I've done that. Like, for example, one interesting technique is a lot of people building dashboards with Durandal. And the dashboard has a bunch of different widgets on it. And they represent that as data structures. And you log in and we pull back your dashboard configuration from the database. So what they'll do is they'll create a for each binding. And inside of the for each binding, they'll have a compose statement. And that compose statement will, instead of having a static string, perhaps each widget has a type property on it. And they'll take that type property and make it the value. And maybe they'll say plus, like some subfolder plus the type property, blah, blah, blah. And then dynamically it will resolve at runtime for each widget, each individual widget. Any questions so far? Just trying to show you like this concept of these core concepts: modularization, composition, binding. They're consistently used over and over, and if you can kind of conceptualize those as a framework, it's actually very, very powerful. Like how far you can go, and what kinds of things you can do. So that's the home screen. Let's look at. We want to look at tickets because tickets was that one that had. Let's not do that. Let's look at users. Users, if you recall, had this optional parameter. So I want to show you what it looks like to. No. I'm sorry, I'm changing my mind. I'm getting a little fickle here. Let's look at tickets first. Tickets is just a standard parameterized URL. So how do we get that ID? Well, again, tickets is kind of broken down into several different modules, but in this app, the pattern is that index is the main sort of the entry point for each feature. So if we look in here, again, it's it's a really simple module. So this is tickets right here with no ID, right? Because that maps to. Let me just show you there. Tickets index. So this looks a lot like the home screen. We're just loading up a list of tickets. The view we'll come back to in a minute. But when you navigate to tickets with an ID, that's actually mapping to this thing called thread. And the important part I want you to see is, well, mainly this activate. We already saw the activate callback earlier, which we talked about how you can return a promise from if you want to. The activate callback is also important in terms of using the router, because if you have a parameterized route, for every parameter in your route, you're going to get an argument in your activate function. So it's going to pass that data right into you. And here we're just literally using that to open up the appropriate tab. There's also something else interesting to see here that I haven't shown you yet, which is another feature of Durandal, which is eventing, app-wide eventing. Notice that when it goes out to the server and it gets that ticket, after that completes, it down here it does this thing called app.trigger tab open. And this is Durandal's app module. And with Durandal's app module, you can publish and subscribe to events. So it's actually the shell that opens up that tab. You saw those tabs across the top. That's part of the architecture of the app. Is the shell has this general concept of being able to open up these tab screens. So if we look at the shell, down here at the bottom, again, there's not a whole lot of code, but notice that when the shell when it starts up, it subscribes to tab open. So this is a really critical feature in Durandal, this pub sub within the app. This is how you generally let disparate modules talk to one another. You can have one module directly reference another module, and that makes sense for scenarios where they're closely related as part of the same feature. But sometimes you just have application-wide events or modules that need to talk to each other that need to remain loosely coupled, like the shell and the various features that are inside of it. So that's a good candidate for this app-wide messaging. That's really all there is to it. You can trigger and you can subscribe to events. You just name the event. Typically, you'll probably want to document the events that you're creating in your app somewhere, because they're just string values. And then you can provide a data payload to go with it, any JavaScript object. And whoever is subscribed to it, any number of subscribers will get that data. So that's a really cool feature, really powerful when you're building complex apps. So this is just an example, also as part of the ticket screen. Okay. So that's how you get parameters. That's how you do publishing of events. There's some other things in here. I know you're going to ask me, is this source code available? And the answer is not quite yet. I am putting together some video training that will build this app from ground zero all the way to the end. So when I do that, this whole thing will be up on GitHub. It still needs a little bit of cleanup before I want to let your prying eyes look at all the details. But I've been using it in presentations like this just to, at a high level, hopefully you guys are starting to see some of the power, and actually, hopefully you're seeing some of the simplicity of like how you can build these complex screens by breaking them down. Now I skipped over users. It's very, very similar to what you already saw. If there is, that was an optional parameter, so if it's there, it'll be passed in. If not, you'll get null, basically. So it goes detecting it, and again, it's just more of the same stuff. Nothing really complicated here. I do want to show you the view because this is another case where composition is used in a slightly different fashion. So our sidebar of users, let's look at it so you can see it here. You have this list over the side, and then as you change them, it's just navigating in and out that part. So here's the list. You can see as you click on them, it's the links have their href based off of the ID of the user generated. So that is what triggers the router. And the router knows that it's the same module that's already being displayed, so it doesn't recompose the whole screen, it just passes in the new parameter if the parameter changed. And you can see that what happens is we get that parameter, and then we load up the user, and we set ultimately we set a property called active item that represents the selected user. I should just call it selected user. And then we've got another really interesting use of this compose binding down here, where we're specifying out a few more properties. And here's what we're actually doing. We're saying we want to dynamically compose the data, but statically compose the view. So this active item is going to be changing every time we navigate to a different user. So watch that property, and anytime it changes, display the new data. But I'm going to tell you exactly what view you need to actually bind this to. So you're going to get users detail HTML, which is rightfully broken out because it's like, gigantic user data form. And play that entrance animation transition whenever we change that. So that animation is that you saw at the router level is a core part of the composition engine. So anywhere that you can compose, you can actually animate, and you can write your own animation. We won't dig into that, but just giving you an idea of the kinds of features of this composition system and different ways that you can use it. So that's how the different users are being switched in and out, just through binding the data against the static view. I will show you one final thing. In tickets, we had our list of tickets, and I skipped over showing you the view. The view looks a little bit strange, actually. Here we've actually got a custom binding called grid, which is a custom Durandal widget that lets you declare some custom HTML inside of it in order to tell it what the column should be named and what HTML content should be in each column, and the data binding expressions for each column, basically. So this is an example of a custom widget that actually makes up that data grid that you saw. And as I mentioned, widgets can be templatable, so I can reuse this grid somewhere else, obviously, and give it a different set of column definitions for different data. And we won't drill into the code of the widget, but if I just expand widgets grid, surprise, surprise, there's a view and a view model, right? So it's built the same way, and guess what? You get all the same callbacks, right? So if you want attached eventifier inside of your widget, you get that, because it's just sugar on top of the composition. And the sugar is that, you get a specific grid binding, basically. None of the covers, it sets a bunch of composition parameters up for you. You could write it all out yourself, but,
So you could have done that as like a for each with TR.
Yeah, there's several different ways this could be done. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that because of what the actual widget code is doing internally, which is some other crazy stuff. But you can see that it's getting this composition complete callback, which is part of the composition engine. So it's just a view and a view model. This one just happens to be a little bit trixier. It uses a few different callbacks and does some internal manual DOM manipulation and things like that. But it lets you keep that out of your app code. So your app code still remains very declarative and simple. So that's widgets. And I think that's all I'm going to show you out of this sample app. Are there any questions? I mean, again, I know I'm going super fast and showing you a ton of stuff, so.
What does delete this dot activate do?
Yeah, so I'll explain that code. I'll explain that code. It's just a little hack. Where was it? Well, it was in home. I think it was also in was it in users too? Or is it in tickets? Be a cleaner place to show us. Yeah. So, well, this is activate, right? It's a function. So I'm actually deleting the function. And the trick that I'm using here is that this causes the function to only be executed once. So if I navigate back to the screen the second time, activate won't actually exist the second time, so Durandal will call it. This is not something you necessarily want to do because you might want to go back to the server and refresh the data. Again, this is a sample app, and there's a bunch of other strategies you might use around data. You might keep a client-side cache, you might refresh it automatically in the background or invalidate it after certain periods of time. You might refresh it every time you navigate to the screen. Maybe it's data you know that's not going to change hardly ever, so maybe you just load it once like this, and then don't ever load it again while the app's running. Those are decisions you have to make based on your knowledge about the data and the domain, but this is probably not something where it should be done. So, but it is in there. So, why don't I just see? That's why I haven't put this on GitHub yet.
This deserves a comment.
Everybody.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Any other questions?
I just had a couple questions. One, I was wondering if you're using like a server-side templating language typically, and you're sort of converting to a single-page app, like you're going from JSP or whatever.
Right.
Can you think of any good reason to continue using server-side templating for certain pieces of the application, even though it's coming inside a single-page app, or would you say you can pretty much always go off JSON data coming through?
That's an interesting question.
I know it's kind of beyond Durandal. It's just more of a generic. In your experience, I was curious what you thought.
It's actually not beyond Durandal. It was in the initial vision, but I actually had people come to me almost immediately after I first launched and said that they wanted to do that. So it wasn't really supported very easily. It is now. So there are people doing exactly what you're talking about.
Where they're mixing it, you mean?
Where they're mixing it, where they have part of the app being generated statically, or not statically, being generated as HTML on the server. And then part of it has knockout bindings. In some cases, the knockout bindings are generated on the server, and some of the data is generated, into the, by the server templated language. And then because Durandal's, we didn't talk about the internals of Durandal, but if you want to dig into how Durandal works, it's down in your scripts directory under Durandal, and it's just a set of modules. So like everything related to composition, if you wanted to learn about it, it's here. But what you're talking about is what we call the view locator. View locator is the thing that you hand a module ID to it, and it goes out and finds the right view. So what they did is they plugged in the view locator and they taught it about server-side generated views. So they mapped from their client-side JavaScript objects to partially server-generated views, and then they bring them in, and then the framework takes over and completes the data binding process. I don't know exactly why they're doing that, to be honest, but some of them were trying to transition a traditional web app into being more spa-like. So I think they were using that in order to incrementally move things over.
So
there were some different scenarios. Were you doing that?
We were doing that for a while for one specific reason. We were using MVC areas to handle some branding concerns within our application. And so we were using the areas convention to locate certain views and also to render some of the...
Does it work?
Yeah.
All right. It wasn't originally designed for that.
Yeah, I mean,
did I talk to you on the forums, or was that other people that I talked to and you just picked it up later?
I didn't read about it on the forum, so that's
okay.
Interesting. But yeah, so that's
but you worked it
what
out.
we're doing.
Cool.
That's cool. Yeah, I was curious if there was a good reason for that.
We are quickly moving away from that though, because I think it looks really hacky, and all the area stuff that we were doing and the partial rendering, we're doing that all client side now.
Yeah.
But the other area where some of this could be of interest is with SEO concerns, having some of it.
Right.
Yeah, I guess like in an ideal world, you'd have your backend guys write REST services quick enough that you can just consume them right away or something.
Right.
But
Yeah, that sounds very similar to one of the other scenarios I heard where there was pre-existing code and they were trying to move it over.
Okay.
There was another scenario too, I can't recall what it was, that was not that, but it does work, obviously.
The other question I had was Adi Asmani has that large scale architecture sort of modules and mediator pattern and facade and things like that. And it seems like you built some of those principles right into Durandal. So like how much, if you're gonna build a Durandal app, like how much do you recommend putting some of that infrastructure outside of Durandal itself? As like, because I know a lot of the frameworks today, it seems like they don't necessarily completely address that.
Right.
Where you'd still maybe want something of your own.
Well,
sort of,
I'm
like if you're
of,
building a Gmail or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah. In most substantial apps, you end up building at least a thin layer on top of something like Durandal that is your app-specific framework. Because you're gonna, if you want to be productive, you're going to you want to be on the lookout for patterns that are unique to the app that you're building, and see if you can write a little bit of your own infrastructure that lets you get rid of boilerplate code that you would have to write. So Durandal has a bunch of generic stuff around that, but generally on each app, I'm thinking of, the last two big apps that I worked on. One of them actually had a significant framework built on top of Durandal that encapsulated a bunch of their patterns around how they handled data and dirty state tracking, and the way they handled things like they had modals, but they weren't like the ones out of the box. They were slide out panels, and sometimes there's shell functionality. Your general experience of your app, the stuff that you want to build in a little framework. Now, in terms of all those patterns, I actually prefer not to think of it like that at all. You heard me use the term compose a lot. There's actually a reason. There's a saying in the object-oriented world, which is prefer composition over inheritance. I don't know if you've heard that or not, but that's really a theme of Durandal. There's actually no inheritance at all inside of Durandal, nor do you ever have to inherit any of your JavaScript objects from it. Now, if you want to do that, you can. But Durandal's key pattern is not so much a design pattern, it's more of that principle of modularizing and then composing. Now, there is, the pub/sub capability, which is sort of like a mediator pattern, right? That's built right in. There is, observables are basically your, it's not mediator, that's what is that pattern called?
Facade.
Well,
Not really.
in a sense to knock out as a facade, or JQuery is a facade, right, for the DOM. But anyways, so in a sense there's a little bit of that, but I think what you do is you start building specific features, and then when you build more and more features, you want to be on the lookout for, what is unique to this app that's common across those things, and then you might choose to factor that out into a set of modules that are support modules for that app. And maybe it turns out to be a mediator pattern, or some facade or something like that. But I prefer not to think of the pattern first, but to think about the feature and then look for commonalities and things like that, and think about factoring out modules that can be composed together, and think about reuse and things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Last question. Is
Wait,
it advisable to use cache views when we have to support IE8? Or in your mind, what are the things to watch for when we have to support IE8?
Don't support IE8.
I wish.
No, yeah, technically Durandal works all the way back to IE6. We have people, I don't know of anyone actually supporting IE6. We do have people deployed for IE7. The real problem, as I'm sure that you're kind of insinuating by your mentioning of that property, is performance, right? Because that's one of the big differences with IE8 and IE9 is IE9, they mostly implemented ES5, but there was a huge difference in the JavaScript engine's performance, and then they added some more. They started to sort of add some of the HTML5 stuff like Canvas. So cache views would be a performance optimization. So that was actually added originally to help in the mobile scenario. Phones that had a small number of screens and to improve performance switching between screens. So I guess you might consider that for IE8, but it's one of those things that, not being a perfect world, it will improve performance, but it will also increase memory, right, and increase the size of the DOM. So that's a trade-off, and so I can't answer that concretely, actually.
Is there a time when you decide that after, say, 100 page views, I will do a hard page log?
That's certainly something that's possible. That what I would do if you're in that situation is to do some actual testing on IE8, and fortunately probably the tools for looking at memory consumption on IE8 are probably non-existent, to be honest. But you could basically see performance of the app over time, and if it starts to bog down or something, through trial and error at least, you could say like, okay, maybe every 15 minutes, maybe you had to set timeout every 15 minutes, you actually like manually go clean that up, or, that might actually even be a feature request you can make with the project to have an API that lets you easily do that. Right now, you can do it, right, because you always jump into the DOM and like, delete nodes out and then manually restart compositions or recompose. There's not an API for that. That might actually be a good feature. But I think you'd have to test that. I think you'd actually have to like open up IE8 and use it for a significant amount of time and see, like on your target hardware. And obviously that can be really hard too, because
is there any shims you are using inside Durandal for IE8?
No, nothing that is not already part of Knockout, JQuery, and RequireJs. Actually, that's another reason why it was built on them, because they all go back to IE6, and I've already worked that out, and then I don't want to have to work some of those things out. So I leverage those frameworks for that kind of stuff as much as possible. In that scenario, I think you're literally just you're going to have to test it, and then if you have a problem, come up with some kind of strategy, whether it's once you reach a certain number of views, clear it out, or after a certain amount of time passes, clear it out, or something like that.
What happens when a new version of the underlying framework comes out, like Knockout or JQuery?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, so far with jQuery, we, so there was a breakage between like 1.8
8.3 or something.
Yeah, and 1.9 or so. Actually, Durandal detects the APIs that it uses internally. It detects which version of doesn't detect version, does feature detection on jQuery itself, and uses the most appropriate API based on the jQuery version. So yes, I had to stay on top of that. But fortunately, Durandal itself does not use a whole lot of jQuery. The surface area that Durandal interacts with is fairly minimal, and I would imagine it's pretty stable stuff. The thing that broke with jQuery was their HTML parsing API, which Durandal uses, changed between like 1.8 and 1.9. So we just released a patch that detected which API was present and used it. So we would definitely do things like that. As far as Knockout goes, I know Steve and some of the other developers on there, so I'm pretty up with what they're doing. They're also actually now taking Durandal into consideration when they're working on Knockout. So that helps because there's a lot of Knockout guys that basically picked up Durandal. They're also very good about backwards compatibility, and I'm testing their stuff before it's released. And I would probably scream at them if they broke Durandal with Knockout. RequireJs I'm not really worried about because its API is like one function, define, and it's actually based off of a common JS standard. specification. So I'm much less worried about that one. jQuery I'm not too worried about again because we use minimal set of the API. And not gotta have that relationship there. So so far it's being handled. I don't think there's really been any problems. If something like that breaks, I can usually get a patch out pretty quick if it's just like something like that. So it's not. Yeah, that is. I mean, that's kind of not even something that's like germane to Durandal, right? It's kind of like the problem with the JavaScript world. I mean, it's great that there's all these libraries out there, and but not every library works with every other library, and they have their own, so it's kind of like, it's almost like pick your poison. If, you can go with some library or framework that locks you into it and it only, and then you got to deal with the problems with that, or you can go with something like what we've done, and then you might have some interoperability problems or whatever. So far, we haven't really had any big issues though with the libraries, and that's why I'm not planning to take any dependencies on anything else. Those 3 libraries were very strategically chosen. They each do one thing, do it very, very well, and we use them in very specific ways. So, so far so good.
So I guess see on GitHub you're pretty much the primary committer. So, are you? I mean, are you pretty committed for the long term, the long run to Durandal? Or
Yeah.
With the bus
Have you worked with Caliber now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as that goes, I'll probably remain the only official committer for a little while. The reason is, having run a few open source projects, I learned a couple lessons by being too anxious to allow official committers too early. That actually something happened with Caliber back in like 2007 or something like that, and I had to anyways. People are complicated, much more complicated than code. So I'm gonna probably keep a pretty tight leash on it for a little while and watch the community to see who in the community takes their own initiative to submit pull requests, because lots of people are submitting pull requests. Right? So who is submitting pull requests? Who's taking their initiative to learn the internals, submit documentation, and then, I don't have a hard time frame on this, sort of like a gut, but then I'll basically contact some people and say, hey, you want to be, join the project as an official committer. So right now it's just me. I'm keeping a pretty tight rein on that. I usually accept pull requests though if they're reasonable. I mean, I have to categorize them because we're keeping semantic versioning. So right now I've got a bunch of pull requests that are not going into 2.0.1 because they add new features. So that has to go in 2.1. We had lots of pull requests that were just pure bug fixes, which usually I take them verbatim and test them, and sometimes I massage the code a little bit, So there's a lot of community contribution through pull requests, but I'm the only official committer right now, and I'm going to keep it that way for just a little bit longer.
Cool.
Because, like I said, I have some past experience where that didn't go quite like I would want. But that does bring up another issue, which is, what happens if I get hit by the bus, right? So, and I always say, well, it's open source. I mean, it's a cop-out answer probably, but there are people in the community that are significantly knowledgeable in Durandal. The community can pretty much stand on its own at this point. So if I did get hit by a bus, somebody would fork the code and it would just continue about. But to address the more, obviously that doesn't satisfy business owners sometimes. Right. So I've got things in the works around more, maybe getting some bigger companies behind it, financially sponsoring, and having contingency plans in terms of things like that. So I'm very conscious of that aspect of it.
Cool.
One, because I want to raise money so I can work on it full time. But two, just because there are lots of people that depend on it. It's just not responsible of me to make make sure that you know, their businesses aren't in panic if something does happen. So there are plans in the works. In the next few months, hopefully, you'll see some news about them. And if you want to be a part of that, just send me an email. I'm looking for sponsors, basically. So, exactly. With a low introductory price. So, $1 million. Yeah, if you work for a company that is interested in sponsoring the project in any way, please do contact me. I'll put my slide deck back up at this point, but you know, we have commercial support options. So that's a great way to sponsor the project. And you get support. But we also do training, you know. This is just a couple hour presentation tonight, but you know, if you're a company that is interested in Durandal, or even if you're not committed to Durandal, but you want to deep dive a little bit more architecturally on building single page apps, you know, I can come in and do a few days of boot camp training, starting from scratch, you know, and digging very deeply into different kinds of patterns, different approaches, problem solution, architectural things. I would use Durandal, obviously. I'm not going to do that training with AngularJS for you, but in theory, even if you are undecided on what platform you're going to be using, then conceptually a lot of the ideas should transfer over. It's interesting across these frameworks, even though there are some different approaches, there are some commonalities as well. You're going to go to those frameworks, you're going to find things like a router. You're going to find things like data binding. You're going to find probably some sort of composition mechanism. I think Durandal kind of excels. I mean, I didn't even show you like the templated composition. There's some really crazy things Durandal can do. You'll find some semblance of things like that in a lot of these frameworks because these are just things you need. So there would be value in the training, I think, even if you were undecided. But so you know, commercial support training, and if you just want to sponsor and you have some idea of what, you know, some visibility, maybe I can help give your company, or if you want to set up some, you know, you have some ideas about maybe what you could do for me or what I could do for you. I mean, you know, just get in contact. Working on that kind of stuff. Angular has Google behind it. I mean, I can't really
Can't do much more
at
power than that.
At that level.
Maybe you
So if that's like your main priority, that's like your only thing you care about. Some companies do, then you know, I can't really help you. But
how much is Microsoft behind Knockout?
yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it's being released with Visual Studio right now. You know, Microsoft is kind of like non-committal about single-page apps right now.
They threw upshot at it.
So yeah, and that's gone away. And they're, I think, you know, like what Microsoft does, right? I mean, they're very not, they're not risk takers, right? So they kind of sit back and they watch for a few years, and then they try and play catch up, right? So right now, as far as I can tell, they're kind of watching the single-page app world, looking to see what's happening, see if anything's going to surface as a winner or whatever. You know, I actually don't really think there's such a thing, but and then you know, maybe they'll do something. As far as I know, they're not building anything. I have demoed my stuff internally to them, but they didn't say anything to me. So they're on my list of to try and squeeze money out of. I've been in open source and interacting with Microsoft for a number of years, so I don't really expect anything from them, but I have an interesting relationship with them. Any other questions? I hope it was at least, you know, I covered a lot of ground. Pretty much all that you found here is in the docs. This source code is not out there yet, so I know that's a little bit of a bummer, but there is a plan. And speaking of ways to you know, if you really like Durandal and are looking for ways to assist, you know, I'm going to put some video training out on this. It probably won't be free, but it's going to be sort of like a micropayment model. It's kind of the plan. So, you know, and this might be like a 10 video series, 10 1-hour videos or something like that. Maybe you pay like $2 a video kind of a deal. So try to make it affordable, and that money gets piped back in that project. So.
They considered doing something on like Pluralsight where they would take a cut, but
Yeah.
probably a lot more exposure.
I'm still figuring all that out. I mean, there's some stuff up there already. John Papa did. That's on 1.2 version of Durandal, and he's planning to update that to 2.0. So there is a Pluralsight course there. I've been contacted by at least 2 or 3 people interested in creating Pluralsight content for Durandal. I'm not sure what's the status of those. I suspect that there will be content on Pluralsight, additional content. That won't come from me. I want to actually have some quote official stuff, and I'm trying to figure out, what's the balance between me implementing my own video marketplace versus using somebody else. Because obviously there's a lot of other stuff involved in that, right? But I'm trying to maximize on the dollars.
The demo app could be how to build a video marketplace.
Exactly.
And make money.
Yeah.
But TechPub, Rob Connery, I don't know if you know TechPub. You and I know each other, and we've chatted a couple times about Durandal. So I'm investigating options. It may be that I end up saying like TechPub has official video training, and maybe I can make a special deal with them or something like that. But it's on the way. All that stuff's on the way, and there are other people independent of me producing video content, or I've at least talked about. In the last 4 months, I had 3 separate well-known software developers contact me asking if they could do a Durandal thing on Pluralsight. So, you would know some of them by name. I haven't checked back to see what the status is, but so I know that stuff's coming. And again, speaking of contributions, if you like Durandal and you want to help the project, a great thing to do is just play around with it, build something, and then write a blog. And if you let me know that you wrote a blog on something, or a series of blog posts, I will tweet it and we will get it out there. Because that really helps the project. Submitting pull requests, providing me with any kind of feedback you can about your experience as a developer. Because a lot of this, for me, I build this because I wanted to build my own stuff, and I have a vision and kind of something in mind about developer experience and how it should go. So it's not there yet, but we're kind of marching towards that. So your feedback on how easy or painful it was to use things, or all that kind of stuff helps me as well. So feedback, blog posts. If you want to produce your own videos about making stuff, I'll help get it out there and make sure that the community knows about it. Anything like that is always real helpful if you're into it.
Or we can go and buy T-shirts from the site.
Or you can buy T-shirts. Yes, this T-shirt is sort of. Yeah. It's like $35 though. So I don't even think I have it on the site anymore. So this is ridiculous. I'm gonna buy this shirt for $35. But there's stuff like that I'm working out too, actually, for T-shirts and other things. I've got a lot of things that I'm working on. Kickstarter, maybe, I don't know, commercial add-ons on top of the Fora project, or all kinds of things. If you have any ideas.
Do you know any examples of large enterprise apps that have been built with Durandal? I'm always kind of.
Yes, but the problem is I can't tell you about a lot of the stuff that I've worked on or seen other people worked on or code reviewed or whatever. I can tell you that there are household names that are using it. Right. Yeah. There are household company names that are using it. There's just about almost anything you can imagine is being built with it right now. We were talking about this at lunch. I went to lunch with some of the guys from Matrix, and dashboard apps. The energy industry is using it to build, energy dashboards. A bunch of dashboard apps. Tooling, game-related products. Line of business, like traditional line of business stuff, where people are talking about hundreds of CRUD screens, I mean, what other? Let's see.
So
I
like
worked on productivity apps.
software as a service type stuff, pretty common.
What's that?
Software as a service type stuff.
Yeah. Silver Reader is an RSS reader written with Durandal. When the Google Reader thing disappeared, they jumped in there and they built their own. It's actually quite nice. That's what I'm using now. That's built with Durandal. So content-oriented apps, games, productivity tooling, content creation tooling, social. What do you call it? Apps.
Yeah.
There's a pretty wide variety of
Awesome.
stuff. Some of it is just people startups just put something out there, and some of it is like very big companies.
Do you have WebSocket support?
So I mean, we don't really. That's not necessarily our domain, so to speak. You can use Socket.io with it and drop it in, and you can use like Signal R, the .NET side, to do that kind of thing. You could use, I don't know if you guys are down with some of the stuff that's happening with the back-endless movement about Firebase. You guys have Firebase? So check that out. They do like real-time messaging, data, update stuff, and someone wrote a knockout extension that ties into the Firebase API, and so all of a sudden all of your objects in JavaScript, which are data bound, become real time based off the changes from the server as they happen. Right? So we don't do anything for that because I'm really focused around like the UI concerns at this point. We might have some other stuff in the future, but right now there's other libraries out there you can just drop them in and there's no problem. I mean, people are using Socket.io and SignalR, and if it works with Knockout, it's going to work with us. For the most part, if it works with JQuery, it's going to work with us. There might be a few exceptions because JQuery plugins are, the gamut. There's some really bizarre stuff, but so no, but you can do it easily. Any other questions? I hope it was valuable. I mean, you're probably not gonna go build an app right now, or you're gonna have to probably dig back to the site because I basically it was like a fire hose showing you a whole bunch of stuff. But I wanted you to come away with a sense of what this is and see how those pieces can kind of come together broadly. So hopefully you got that, and hopefully you'll try it out. And if you haven't already, and send me some feedback and join the community, get involved, and have fun building stuff.